Raw electricity powers everything in our technology-dependent society. But how safe is the grid from some well-documented threats? I'm Tanya Hall for ZDNet, and joining me is Frank Gaffney. He is the president of the Center for Security Policy and former acting Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Nice to be with you.
So what is your mission at the Center for Security Policy?
We've been, for about 30 years, promoting what my old boss, President Ronald Reagan, used to call peace through strength. And it's gratifying that we have a president who's now working to do the same. We have been addressing a broad array of issues over all those years, but the sort of common denominator is the world is a safer place when the United States is strong and able to protect both its own interests and those of freedom-loving people elsewhere.
All of our technology is dependent upon a clean, uninterrupted flow of electricity from our power grid. So your team has identified threats to the function of the security of the grid from sources like physical sabotage, cyber attacks, electromagnetic pulse, EMP, and space weather. So let's start with the EMP, the electromagnetic pulse. What is it and how is it produced?
Electromagnetic pulse can be produced in several different ways. The most efficient is by setting off a nuclear device, a weapon in space, where the gamma rays that that weapon will produce interact with the upper atmosphere and create immense loads of electromagnetic energy. And it comes in different phases. A very short phase, which is known as E1, that can fry things like chips and transistors and small electronic gear. A somewhat longer phase known as E2, which is kind of like lightning, and then the longest phase, which is E3, and that operates as a kind of pulse through antennas. And just turns out that America's high voltage power lines are perfect antenna for E3 and will, unless protected against, wind up sending those pulses into the backbone of the electric grid, which are high voltage transformers. And again, unless they are protected, almost certainly burning them out with catastrophic consequences for the electric grid.
North Korea has 2 satellites in orbit over North America. Are there concerns about them using these to launch an EMP attack on the United States?
Yeah, it depends obviously on whether there's a nuclear weapon on board, either of those or both. My colleagues, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry and former CIA Director Jim Woolsey, have speculated that there's reason to believe that they might have nuclear weapons aboard them, in which case there is a concern that those satellites, which operate at precisely the altitude over the Earth that you would want for maximum effect, a single nuclear weapon detonated at about 300 nautical miles where those orbit, could cover essentially the entire continental United States with one blow. And if that were to happen, and the effects are as damaging as we think they would be, the United States could be without power. Those high voltage transformers across the country could be essentially destroyed. And we would be in a world of hurt, as they say. Perhaps 90% of our population would perish if the power isn't brought back on stream in the first year of a blackout.
Frank, how do we protect the power grid today, and what additional steps do we need to be further prepared?
I think the ways that we can protect the power grid are just very straightforward, common sense measures that the United States military has actually been perfecting for decades now. They've actually been very cognizant of this threat of electromagnetic pulse attack because there was a concern that the Soviet Union back in the day might use it to take down our defenses. So they found that if you put in basically surge protectors, kind of like hopefully what you have protecting your computer from a random surge in electric power, or things like called shunts that would move a power surge around whatever it is you're trying to protect, or a Faraday cage, a device that's basically meant to keep ambient electromagnetic pulses from damaging whatever you're trying to protect. Your microwave oven is, for example, a Faraday cage. I'm fond of saying that you can put whatever it is you're trying to protect in it, just don't turn it on. That's the problem. But basically, those are three techniques that would enable, you'd have to scale them up, obviously, depending on what it is you're trying to protect. But those are known and pretty effective measures for assuring that these key pieces of our most critical of critical infrastructures are safeguarded against that sort of attack.
If the grid goes down due to EMP, how do we repair, replace, or manufacture new substation equipment like transformers?
It's very difficult to do, needless to say. You're not going to manufacture much of anything without electricity. Now, many of these transformers are produced overseas, and if they're not affected, then theoretically they could provide transformers that would replace those that are damaged here. But the trouble is that these things are very labor intensive and time consuming to produce. You may need a year, year and a half to get one, and that's if you're at the front of the line to get them. In the meantime, you're without power, and that is, as I said, an unsustainable situation for a nation like ours that depends critically, as you said, on electricity basically for every aspect of life in 21st century America.
Is Congress aware of this vulnerability? And if so, what's being done by government to protect the grid?
Congress is to some degree aware of the vulnerability. I don't know that they are sufficiently knowledgeable about it to actually be doing much to fix it. And this has been a great frustration. I think that they, like the federal regulatory body known as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, are unduly dependent upon the electric utilities, which own, by some measures, 85% of the electric grid in the private sector, for explanations of what could be done or what should be done to protect those assets. It's not an unreasonable calculation that these guys know all about these transformers and other pieces of the electric grid. They would be the obvious places to go for information about how to protect them. It's just that the electric utilities have proven to be very resistant to efforts to take steps like those I've mentioned that would enable their assets to survive, which seems unimaginable since they are, after all, their assets, and their business model is a result of those assets working and providing power to consumers. But they have, for whatever reason, chosen to be rather resistant, as I say, to fixing the vulnerabilities, the lack of resiliency in our grid today. And as a result, Congress isn't doing much. The federal government, executive branch isn't doing very much. The states have begun looking at possibly filling that void, but even they aren't doing as much as they should at the moment.
Let's discuss cybersecurity. Are we seeing cyber attacks on electric utilities?
There have been cyber attacks on electric utilities. The most obvious ones have been in Ukraine, where Russian hackers turned off the lights in Ukraine twice over various periods, relatively short term, but nonetheless did do that. Iranian hackers are believed to have turned off Turkish lights. Even drug traffickers have turned off the lights in Mexico using cyber means. So this is a well-known vulnerability, a relatively easy axis of attack, and it has been shown to be effective in taking down grids, at least for short periods of time, and conceivably could do much more intensive damage if that was the desire of the attackers.
How is the government working with utilities to enhance security?
Mostly not. I think it's fair to say. They have, from time to time, expressed an interest in having the utilities do that. The utilities have from time to time expressed a willingness to do that. From time to time, they actually get together and talk about doing something about it. But by and large, we are still in the vulnerable state we are in, with the grid susceptible to both the EMP threat that we talked about, electromagnetic pulse, the cyber threat that we just were discussing, and also physical sabotage to a degree that I believe amounts to an invitation to hostile powers to attack so vulnerable and so critical a piece of infrastructure as our grid.
Wasn't there, in fact, an attack on a substation in the Bay Area in 2013?
Yeah. Speaking of physical sabotage or attacks, yes, in April of 2013, there was indeed an attack. It was officially described as an act of vandalism. We subsequently learned that it was a very professional job. And but for the fact that in carrying it out, the perpetrators, who, by the way, are presumably still at large, they were not apprehended, neglected to cut one of a number of fiber optic cables that they severed that happened to link that major substation in the outskirts of San Jose, California. Well, frankly, we would not be having this conversation because we would probably still be recovering much of Northern California from the effects of the attack because it would have destroyed at minimum 17 and possibly as many as 21 of these high voltage transformers, which, as I said, are, as a practical matter, very difficult, if not essentially irreplaceable. And that would be something, therefore, we would probably still be trying to overcome these many years later.
Tell us about the Carrington event of 1859.
The Carrington event is a class of electromagnetic pulse from a different source. So we talked about the man-induced nuclear attacks. This is a naturally occurring phenomenon. The Carrington class of solar weather or space storms, if you will, is an extremely serious problem for things like our electric grid today. Back then, in 1859, which was when the most recent of these major solar storms took place, the electric grid of the United States was basically telegraph systems, and those caught fire and were destroyed by and large. If a similar level of electromagnetic energy were unleashed by the sun, and we've done nothing to protect our grid against it, the likelihood is that much of it would be destroyed as those telegraph systems were back in the day. These things happen roughly every 150 years. So if you do the math, you realize that we're in the zone for another Carrington class event.
NASA says there's a 12% chance of a major Earth-directed solar outburst every 10 years. So what are we likely to experience if that happens? I mean, how long would it take if we had another Carrington magnitude event happen again?
How long would it take to try to recover from it? Is that
Correct.
The question? It's anybody's guess, quite frankly. Again, if we've done nothing to try to make the grid more resilient against those kinds of pulses, whether it's from the sun or whether it's from a nuclear attack, or even locally, you can generate large amounts of electromagnetic energy through test kits, in fact. Depending on the magnitude of the damage that's done, if you lose those transformers, as I say, it is a long time before you're able to bring the kind of grid back online that we have today. If that E1, that short phase of electromagnetic pulse, widely destroys chips and transistors and the like, you will find those somewhat easier to replace if you've got replacements for them. But again, without electricity, the chips working or not working is kind of immaterial. You have to have the key elements of the grid protected, specifically and most importantly, these high voltage transformers. And the answer to your question is it depends. My prayer is that we will take steps in the very near future. We should have done it long before now, frankly, to create through the use of those militarily proven technologies like surge protectors and shunts and the like, to maximize the resiliency of our high voltage transformers, at least until such time as we've gotten microgrids in place, which I think are ultimately the answer to this problem. Get us away from the dependency on those large transformers and the power that they move through power lines all over the country from a relatively small number of generators of the electricity in the first place.
All right, Frank, what advice do you have for businesses and individuals who want to prepare for a major grid down event?
Well, I think there's preparation at the personal and individual companies level, and then there's preparation at the national level. I'm all about people taking steps to try to ensure that they have quantities of food and water and medicine, the means to heat their homes in the event you get it coming down the grid, that is, in the wintertime and that sort of thing. The much more important action item that I would recommend, though, is trying to make sure that we as a nation take steps to prevent the grid from being destroyed in the first place. It's a very difficult thing, frankly, to contemplate, having 300 plus million people all surviving, even if they've made preparations to have a week's worth of food, for example, on hand. If the effects of having the grid go down might be that there would be no food coming for a year or more. So it's vastly better for us to take the steps to try to protect against this eventuating in the first place. And that requires all of us, I believe, every single one of us, to engage with our elected officials and representatives, insisting that they take steps to enhance the resiliency of the grid, because otherwise they're condemning potentially millions of us to certain death.
Wow. That's big news and something to be prepared for. Thanks again for all that you do to help educate us on this issue, Frank. If somebody wants to connect with you, or maybe they want to find out more about the Center for Security Policy, how can they do that?
The center's website is a great resource. I commend it to your listeners. It is securefreedom.org. If you want to drill down specifically on this issue of the vulnerability of the electric grid, we have another site, securethegrid.com.
All right. Thanks again for your time. And if you want to connect with me or find more of my interviews, you can do that right here on ZDNet or Tech Republic, or maybe go to my website, which is tanyahall.net. I have links to all my social sites, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. In fact, if you have a question or you'd like to chat, I hope you'll find me on Twitter at Tanya Hall Radio. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.